Thank you all for joining. My name is Joe Cotton, and I'm the Director of Pastoral Care and Outreach out here in the Archdiocese of Seattle, and I'm a member of the Executive Committee for the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition, and it is my honor today to serve as the host of today's webinar. I am really excited about our presenter today, who I know personally and have had the honor of working with for several years. We're in for a treat. And so I'll introduce him in just a moment, but I would love to just start us off with a prayer this morning to kick off our webinar today. Again, thanks to each of you for joining us. It is a joy to be with all of you and to be with our CPMC community. But let us pray today, and this is a prayer that is adapted from one that Mother Teresa wrote. And so we pray together in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Jesus, you who suffer, grant that today and every day I may be able to see you in the person of your loved one experiencing disability, and that by offering them my care, I may serve you. Grant that even if you are hidden under the unattractive disguise of anger, of crime, or of disability, may I recognize you and say, Jesus, you who suffer, how sweet it is to serve you. Give me, Lord, this vision of faith, and my work will never be monotonous. I will find joy in harboring the small whims and desires of all those who suffer. Dear loved one experiencing disability, you are more beloved to me because you represent Christ. What a privilege I am granted in being able to care for you. O God, since you are Jesus who suffers, deign to be for me also a Jesus who is patient, who is indulgent with my faults, and who looks only at my intentions, which are to love you and to serve you in the person of each of these children of yours who suffer. Lord, increase my faith, bless my efforts and my work now and forever. Amen. Well, good morning, everybody. Today it is my delight to introduce to you Dr. Larry Sutton. Deacon Larry is a deacon of the Diocese of Pittsburgh, and he's the director of pre-theology formation at St. Vincent College and Seminary. But in addition to his work at St. Vincent's, Deacon Larry works as a psychologist at the Wesley Spectrum Services in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he was a former manager of the Western Region Office of the Bureau of Autism Services in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Personally, I have had the honor of working with Deacon Larry out here in Seattle as Deacon Larry created a model of faith formation for children with autism and other special needs. And we deployed that model out here at our Catholic Cathedral in Seattle. So we flew Deacon Larry out several times, not only to advise us and to prepare us in developing that model, but also to work with some of our other parishes to consult with them on how to catechize children with autism or with other experiencing other disabilities. He is the author of, I think, 3 books now. The first was entitled How to Welcome, Include, and Catechize Children with Autism and Other Special Needs, a parish-based approach. And again, that's talking about the model that we were able to implement out here in Seattle. And then he also authored a second book called Teaching Students with Autism in a Catholic Setting, both published by Loyola Press. And I believe there's a third book out too that Larry will talk about. So with that, it is my honor to say, Deacon Larry, it is so good to be with you. Thank you for joining our Catholic Prison Ministries community, and we look forward to hearing what you have to share today.
Thanks very much, Joe. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be with you today. My screen should have been shared. Is it up? Cool, good. Autism's a complicated disorder. Let me introduce myself first. I'm a deacon from the Diocese of Pittsburgh and a clinical psychologist. I've worked with people with developmental disabilities now for quite a number of years. And it was surprising to me to find individuals with autism everywhere I've gone, whether it was in a prison setting, which I did in the early 2000s, or in church, or here in the seminary. And I'll talk briefly about that. That's the third book, Autism and Holy Orders. This isn't the forum to talk about that at this point. But autism is very present. 1 in 44 are thought to have autism. And although very few of those individuals end up in prison or any type of incarceration, some of them do, but they need to be recognized. Part of what I hope to do today was to share with you a little bit on how to recognize individuals that might have autism, a teen or an adult, what's involved in the diagnosis of autism, how to communicate with someone that may be in the autism spectrum, and to challenge you with certain questions. And this was an important one for me initially. Is somebody who offends always an offender? I'll talk a little bit about social learning, how you learn from your best friends or from others on how to do certain things, and those things may not exactly be legal. We'll talk a little bit about meaningful intervention and how I ended up writing or creating or helping to create the curriculum Healthy Relationships, a guide to adulthood, which is what I'd like to spend some time on, meaningful intervention. I think where I became focused with the need to develop this type of an intervention came when I was the head psychologist of the Bureau of Juvenile Services in Pennsylvania. I was the only PhD that existed for our number of youth development centers and forestry camps in the state. There were quite a few of them. At that time, we had 2 sex offender units. One of them was located in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, where as I was introduced to many of the residents that were living there at the time by the master's level psychologist, I turned to him and I asked him, I said, I didn't know that you had autistic individuals here. And he looked at me and said, well, we don't. And I thought, well, I'm talking to somebody right now, and you don't recognize him, of course. He was higher functioning. And indeed, the census had 0 people that were identified, the 200 and some men that were in that facility identified as having autism. So I ended up doing a study, which I'll talk a little bit about. It turned out that 64% of them were in the autism spectrum in the sexual offender program. There's a reason why that particular program and not some of the others. You know, if you're doing unusual behaviors and it involves anything sexually related, and you're a judge and you have the opportunity to have somebody housed and evaluated and worked with or kept out of society for 18 months at a time, these facilities were fairly safe places to put people that you didn't know what else to do with, for better or for worse. You might recognize this as a toothbrush and a washcloth. I had a 12-year-old come in, which is the youngest that came into that particular facility. They went from 12 until 21. When the aide first presented these instruments to him, he kind of saw a wash rag that indicated he'd never used it before, but he didn't know what a toothbrush was. And it occurred to me from that point, as well as I continued to work with some of these individuals, if we're to teach or to shape in proper sexual types of behaviors or remediate sexual offending behavior, and they don't understand basic ways of caring for themselves, how do we get higher level learning when the basics aren't being done? And that was basically the fruit of how I started to do it, how I started to put that curriculum together. So I'll talk to you today about individuals that I've worked with, some of how I got to where I got to, some of the settings where it's very surprising to see some of the individuals there. Some of them, had not very high intelligence quotients. Some of them were gifted, very intelligent individuals, IQs of above 145, for example, and yet they were involved with criminal justice. I can remember one of the early individuals that I had worked with was a young man. He wasn't in jail at the time, he was about to be. because something occurred to him when he was in ninth grade, 8th or 9th grade. He had a special relationship with his teacher. This teacher basically looked out for him a little bit. But one day in 8th grade, 3 or 4 of his male peers essentially ganged up on him and bullied him pretty severely. The teacher was there. Teacher didn't do anything, and he so resented her for that. He kept it inside and he kept ruminating it, and his anger just kept building, but he didn't have any way to express it because it was just in his head, and he didn't know how to express his anger, but it kept building and building. It got to the point that he ended up seeing a counselor, and the counselor said, well, why don't you write it down, what you're feeling at the time, and then throw it away? He thought, well, that's a good thing to do, and he started to do that. Then in comes email. He discovered this teacher's email address, and he would type it out, what he wanted to say, and he would delete it. And that was pretty good until the day that he actually hit send. And this poor teacher received this horrible, very threatening email from him about the things that he wished to do with her or to her because of how she didn't help him. That, of course, happened until he ended up seeing her in a grocery store with her 3 little children, and was quite freaked out by the fact that she was a real person that had a real family. He separated her from reality. She was just this ugly person for a while until he saw her in real life, and then really broke down from that point forward. We were able to work with him. Another type of an individual, which I won't spend a lot of time here, conflict counsel in the county around the city of Pittsburgh asked me to come to assist with a man that they thought might be in the autism spectrum. This was in around 2010. As he grew up in the early 1990s, DSM-3R was actually just published. In that, it did not talk very much about higher functioning forms of autism. Well, as I went to work with this man, his young daughter had been murdered very badly. She was left in a very cold winter night here in Pittsburgh, near Pittsburgh on a railroad track. And they really had very little evidence of anything to associate it with anyone at the time. They went looking for her and eventually found her, unfortunately frozen on this railroad track without a diaper on. Once they found her, this man basically went back home, very depressed, very upset, as was his wife. But he didn't react any further. They found her, that was the end of it. He didn't suggest that it could be anybody else. He just was kind of, because his affect was so flat, the police at the time thought this must be him. Well, they had a tremendous prosecutor for the case that handles all the capital cases. And he made a very strong case that this man knew what he was doing, left his daughter out there, did this on purpose. And in fact, he sexually assaulted her because they found blood on her diaper. Well, it was the farthest thing from reality, but he was not able to defend himself. I learned after the trial, he didn't get the death penalty. That was one of the reasons I was brought in, to kind of provide reason as to why that shouldn't occur. We found out afterwards it was very likely another family member who had done this, but everyone in the family was so scared of that individual that they thought it was just fine for this man to take the offense for it. And he couldn't defend himself. And in fact, he had, it was either across his forehead or across his neck, the little girl's name tattooed across him, just as a remembrance of her. One of the hard things is that they're not able to really defend themselves very well, and in fact can be easily provoked, as happened in court a couple of times with him. When something was said and directed towards him, he became very upset and almost was taken out of the courtroom at the time. Well, the presence of autism in a juvenile prison. If I talk too fast or you can't understand me, please let Joe Cotton know so that he can flag me and tell me to slow down or shut up or something. Yes, and he'll do that very well. I focused in at Newcastle on looking at autism that may be there. As I said, when I first got there, I found an individual that was clearly in the autism spectrum, more high functioning. High functioning, as I'll describe a little bit later in this presentation, is a type of individual where language doesn't seem to be a problem, may not have been, but they have other symptoms of autism present. They have some of the social problems, some of the repetitive behavior and sensory problems, but they likely have an IQ that's above 84 or one standard deviation below the average range or higher. This man clearly was in the average range. He was fairly bright. And what I found was in the sexual offender unit, many of the individuals appeared to have autism. So I ended up using the program that they had, by the way, at Newcastle was actually considered state of the art at the time. They were very good at what they were doing for individuals who were neurotypical, individuals that don't have autism. But those for autism wasn't quite the same. So I was able to get a small grant to more formally study these individuals. So there was me, and I had doctoral students from Duquesne University from their school psychology program. And we did a great deal of evaluation. I'll show in a subsequent slide. At the bottom of this slide, you see the references to two of the more major publications that were received from this, where the number of individuals with autism were identified. And also in the second publication, the fact that depression and anxiety were also very much present as well. The instruments that we did, we looked at autism questionnaires, the detailed mental status examination, and an instrument, the ASDS. It's an Asperger screening instrument. Asperger's technically doesn't exist anymore. It's considered a higher form of autism. It's a term that I find myself still using a great deal because so many individuals who were diagnosed with it have an identification with it as well. But it's a high functioning form of autism where language doesn't seem to be as much impaired. I also used a trauma questionnaire. Since these individuals were all under the age of 21, I wanted to look at areas of trauma just to see. We looked at intelligence using different types of adult child Wechsler instruments, a nonverbal instrument using the unit, and a wide range achievement test at the time. And I did a number of mood or personality instruments of note, primarily the Beck depression, Beck hopelessness, as well as a couple of others. And we used one sex offender instrument. Because of time, I'm not going to go through each of these, but I will identify some of what we found. In my first screening, using just the Asperger diagnostics scale, syndrome diagnostic scale, 62% of those individuals from that particular sex offender unit appeared to be in the autism spectrum. That was enough to justify me to go on and to do a more formal evaluation on these individuals. You can see basically these individuals were just below average for the most part as a group, average going 90 to 110. These are just under 90. Much to my disappointment, the nonverbal tests, which I would have thought would have been much higher, didn't turn out to be very useful. Those results were much lower. So it was an interesting conundrum for me to discover it. The Beck depression and Beck hopelessness scale also showed a very significant depression in the group that was considered autistic versus the non-autistic group. Similarly, although not as dramatically, was the hopelessness scale. Many years ago, I got to meet Aaron Beck, and he talked to me about the instruments that he put together, saying that if you have a score in the moderate range of Beck depression and a score of 10 or greater on the hopelessness scale, he used it as a suicide indicator. And so for that point forward, I started using the two instruments together. On the trauma screening instrument, you can quickly look at this, and we'll have the PowerPoint available if you'd like to look at it in your leisure. Most significantly was the sexual abuse in the middle. The average for the individuals in the autism spectrum were in the severe to the extreme range. Actually, both sets were. What this suggests is that many of these individuals were sexually abused or traumatized before they committed their offenses, before they were incarcerated. For someone that's in the autism spectrum that may not know better, and I'll have perhaps an example or two if we have time, if something's done to you by your parent or by a relative of some sort that's sexually related, you don't know the difference between abuse and non-abuse. So if this is the way it's supposed to be, that must be, what sex is about. And some of these individuals didn't know that until after they had done it to someone else and were subsequently arrested. It really raised the question to me, are these sexual abusers, of course they did, or someone that was arrested for sexual abuse? The rehabilitation was much, much more successful with these individuals. What I found in Newcastle was that there was a lot of autism and a lot of trauma. Autism and trauma together are very difficult to work with. It's a seminar all by itself. Somebody who's been traumatized, there's very detailed protocols on how to work with someone that may have been traumatized for any number of a variety of situations. But when you put autism in as well, where they have so many sensory distortions and sensory sensitizations, traditional trauma therapy is really not the therapy of choice to work with these individuals, because they can break down much more rapidly when they have the sensory input. But again, that's another session at some other point. So at this point, I'm going to give what this psychologist's perspective is on what autism basically is, how I would diagnose it, how I would recognize it. You're not going to become an expert or even somebody very good at recognizing autism based upon this couple of minutes that I'm going to give you, but you can see the gist of what it is and why I need to start with looking at developmental history. But before I do that, Joe, was there any questions on anything I had said up to this point in time?
The one question that came through was in the slides, you reference ASD. Can you clarify what ASD stands for?
ASD is autism spectrum
disorder. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I trip on things when I'm not prepared. Okay, not too autistic. Defining autism, what it is and what it isn't. No other questions, right, Joe? Yeah, we're good. Okay. And interventions or methods of communication. The first step in providing meaningful intervention with someone who's in the autism spectrum is to regularly recognize when it's there. It needs to be emphasized that autism is not a psychiatric disorder, it's a developmental disorder. It's something that you're born with. Although there's a diagnostic term for it, a diagnostic number that's associated with it, it's not part of the psychiatric disorders per se. You can't give a medication to cure it. You can't give a treatment to cure it. What you do is that you learn how to manage it rather than cure anything. So in order to do this, even though I evaluate lots of adults that may be in the autism spectrum, where it's at all possible, I try to look at the first criterion. These symptoms needed to be present when the individual was a toddler, something between birth and age 5 or 6. Even if the parent didn't recognize it, didn't see it as being very unusual, they needed to be present that early. My note at the bottom says that by age 3, and it's really closer to 5 or 6. So I'll go through. As you can see, Asperger syndrome was at one point diagnosed until May of 2013, when the DSM-5 first came out, where it was moved to what's considered high-functioning autism. The distinction between typical autism and Asperger's or high-functioning autism is a lack of apparent language problems. But let me go in and talk a little bit about language. Typically, one has their first words by the time they're 1 year of age, give or take a couple of months. They're able to speak in small sentences or phrases between 18 and 24 months of age. If they don't meet these milestones, all that that's saying at that point in time is that they have a delay in expressive language. I'll also look to see, do they understand what's being said to them? Or do you find yourself rephrasing or rewording things? Again, this is at the time when they're a toddler. They may do it later on in life, or may require you to reword things later on in life. For example, when I do evaluations, you may have noticed my voice is a little bit deep. When I see individuals, somebody that comes with them to the evaluations may often reword things initially so that they can understand both the question and understand what I'm saying, because people with deep voices sometimes are hard to fully understand. But if it continues for an extended period of time, then you wonder if they really are understanding or processing language correctly. Are they able to express their thoughts in words even when they're upset or angry? or some clear way of functional communication? Is there a latency or delay in how they respond? Do you ask a question and you wait? One of my examples of someone that I worked very closely with was a young man that I would ask a question. And if you've ever waited a whole minute for someone to give you a response, it's tedious to wait that long. He would come back with these remarkable answers. It took him that long to hear what I was saying, to process the information, and come back out with a response. They look like they have an intellectual impairment because they can't come back quickly. They often get talked over because it takes so long. In fact, this particular individual is probably pretty close to the average range of intelligence, but the instrumentation that we had available at the time wasn't very sufficient to do this. Sometimes they don't get what you're saying. They don't understand tone. They can't read faces very well. They do not process people or attributes about them. They need scripts to know how to respond in certain situations. They'll often look towards models on how they're supposed to respond, which is why jail can be good or bad. If somebody doesn't know how to make friends, which I'll talk about in a second, and you're living with somebody for 18 months or much longer, they become your new best friend. What I found in some of the therapies that they did in traditional sex offender therapy, for example, was that they would have these fantasy types of journals or journals that they would write on things that they would think about so that the counselor could work with them. What was happening was that my individuals with autism were all of a sudden incorporating new symptoms into their journals, new symptoms in terms of what they did in the past. They were taking what they learned from their new best friends and beginning to understand, well, this is what you do when you have sex, because it's my best friend that's doing it, not connecting that it's still illegal or wrong or hurtful to somebody else, but my best friend's doing that, which frightened me to no end, which is why we ended up separating the individuals with autism from the rest of the population. All right, we've done this a little bit already. Social. Does the individual know how to play? Do they know how to use their leisure time? Oftentimes, they don't know what to do when they're bored. So they'll cling to a caregiver, they'll cling to a parent, to a guard, as they did in the juvenile jail. They don't recognize social cues. They'll ask me, why are you so fat? Or why is your head so bald? Things of that nature. Very clear type of statements, even though they're not very socially nice. So they don't, and they don't understand why people get upset with them when they use these very blunt, frank descriptions. They don't know how to play by conventional rules. They're often, when they're younger, leading the games, and they have rules for the games where they're always going to win because they understand the rules the best, and they change the ones so that they can win. Or at times, when they try to play with others, they don't typically stay. They'll wander away, or they'll play something else, or they'll try to persuade them to change them to his rules, but they often don't. So they'll walk away. They don't really seem to have empathy, which is a problem with large types of principles. They recognize that once they've done something wrong, they know if you've taught a replacement behavior for them to use, what they're supposed to use instead. And so once they've apologized to you, it's done. What else do I have to do? I've already told you I'm sorry. But again, no affect on their face, no showing it, no understanding or recognition of it. They don't really recognize clear peer relationships. And since they don't have many close friends, other than perhaps their siblings, if they have siblings, they learn, of course, from social learning, perhaps from television. They learn how people make friends on one of their favorite sitcoms, whatever it might happen to be. You know, where it gets scary is when they become adolescents, adults. We'll see two strangers meeting for the first time at the beginning of a show, and somehow by the end of the show, the two individuals are in bed together. So that must logically mean that if I find somebody that I'm interested in, she's going to want to go to bed with me very soon afterwards, because they skip all the middle processes, and they don't know different. So unless they have a script on what courtship is about or what dating is about or anything of that nature, they don't know that they're missing something. And so they end up in trouble or being the product of a designing other. somebody that's going to take advantage of them? Do you know that such and such likes to have this done to her? Why don't you go to do it? And she'll be very happy about that. They end up in criminal justice trouble when that occurs. Sometimes they don't recognize the intensity of feelings. If somebody is upset, whether they're yelling or not yelling, may be perceived as if they are yelling. If they're part of a group and the individual, a teacher, for example, or an authority figure of some sort, basically is yelling at someone in the group or yelling at the group, they're going to personalize it. They're going to take it to themselves. And they may go home to a parent or to a partner and talk about how they were yelling at me today, and I didn't have anything to do with what he was talking about, things of that nature. Social communication isn't wrong. They may respond to the wrong thing. They may repeat a phrase under their breath. I have a funny example that I used, and Joe may recall this particular example. I work with seminarians, and I had a young man that was very, very bright. He had a very short temper, but he was also an MC for the local bishop. And he knew exactly how things were supposed to go. And he would often set up ceremonies. One of the problems he had, though, which he wasn't aware of, is that he would mumble instructions under his breath. So you could see his lips moving. Couldn't always hear him, but sometimes you could. But he was rehearsing so that he could process it in a different part of his brain. It was interesting once one figured out that he wasn't responding to other people or imaginary people. He was just rehearsing for himself. But because of his temper, if things deviated or changed, he would become upset, and his temper was very short. And there was this one particular procession where the bishop, who was very social to people, as they were processing down, stopped and looked at people in the aisle and started conversing with someone. Well, the seminarian turned around and saw this and whispered under his breath, "That son of a bitch," thinking that no one heard him. Everybody, of course, heard him and were just shocked by this seminarian that's dressed as he was, calling his bishop what he called him. And again, poor individual had no idea that anybody could hear him, let alone recognize what he had said. Leave that go and keep going. One of the chief behavioral symptoms is repetitive behaviors. I like to look at when they're younger. Again, that's when the diagnostic time frame is. Any type of ritual or repetitive behavior that they may do, not just asking the same question over and over and over again, because they do that as well. Do they tap over and over? Do they open and close doors, shut it, light switches on and off? Do they line up their toys in a specific order, their matchbox cars, for example, by color, by shape, by model? Do they turn the cars upside down and spin the wheels? Do they lay in their back if there's a ceiling fan and just watch the fan for hours and hours, or until their parent or someone pulls them away? They still may have this type of a problem. That type of self-stimulation or self-stim goes on and on in many instances for a lifetime, because they become almost hypnotized with it. It becomes so pleasant for them, and they'll repeat things over and over. Or they picky eaters because of the texture, the taste, the smell, the look at certain foods. Do they have problems with tags in their clothes? I think almost everybody I know has problems with tags in their clothes, and that doesn't mean that everybody is autistic, but it's one of the symptoms that they become very sensitive to. Or the seams on their pockets, or the various clothing that they wear, they may be bothered by. Their socks have to be lined up just correct, the seam across the top of their toes, otherwise they can't get the shoes on, which means they can't get to their next destination. Sometimes their sensitivity to sound, either people noise, lots of people in the same room making lots of noise, or mechanical noises bother them. So they require sometimes sound sensitive earphones. These work very good in movie theaters where you can hear just specific things and not the crowd noise around you, for example. All of these things, as I've discovered here in the seminary, affect individuals to a greater or lesser extent, even if they're very, very, very high functioning. They may not recognize that they're in the spectrum. No one else in the seminary may recognize that they're in the spectrum, but for whatever reason, I keep a little mental list when I see some of these things of individuals and begin to try to help them to manage it again. Now, these are symptoms that you might see in individuals that you might see in a criminal justice setting. It gives me pause to maybe provide an example of an individual that I saw in the Allegheny County Jail, the county surrounding the city of Pittsburgh. I was asked to do a mental status evaluation for the public defender's office on this individual, brief psychological, in other words. And I went in and I did the evaluation. He was a large man, very large man, heavy set, wasn't very talkative, and I was getting ready to finish it. And I said, for the just sake of conversation, how's the food here? The food here, can you imagine? How could you possibly eat this stuff? Do you know that I've lost 40 pounds since June? And this was September. I looked at him. Well, tell me, how are you sleeping at night? Could you sleep with people coming around all the time and with flashlights and various things? I said, do you wake up more than once? I'm up most of the night, up and down all night long. And I started asking a variety of vegetative types of questions and was caught off guard. I gave him the ASDS, as it turns out, the instrument I referred to earlier. And I also gave the Beck depression. He had very severe depression. And of course, I didn't need the ASDS, but I basically went through it for myself just to confirm that it was getting enough of the symptoms to identify it. He had a high functioning form of autism and a very severe depression. Result of that evaluation, in addition to the main purpose, which was to write it for the public defender's office, went to the psychiatrist that oversaw the jail, of which there's unfortunately so few of them. It ended up prescribing, of course, an antidepressant, which helped him through part of his way. Because he was so large, people didn't recognize the weight that he had lost. He had legitimately lost that much weight. And with somebody that doesn't complain and doesn't go to the nurse for various things, they just didn't know about it. I think I'm going to skip this example for now. Executive functioning is an area of problems that individuals sometimes have, where they need to sort and organize how to do things. They need to remember things. They can't always keep things on track. They're often sometimes misidentified with, it also goes along with attention deficit type of disorders as well. Giving them functional ways to remember things. I know when I work with individuals that aren't incarcerated, I'll sometimes teach them about how to use either a planner of some sort or a pocket notebook where they can write what's coming next, what they need to be doing, cues, so they know what's coming in the future. Often very bright individuals never learned how to study properly because things came easily to them. They may not have known how to make friends, but they could read and they could ace academic stuff fairly well. But when you get into high school and into college, you're required to do research and perhaps a whole lot more reading. They didn't know how to do this, or doing projects. You're given an assignment that's in September that's due in December. You're going to wait until the last minute, of course, like everything else, to finish it, only to discover at the end of November, beginning of December, when you attend to that task, that there's way too much to do and too many details for you to keep in mind to be able to attend to that, which is problematic. So we'll go on. Rules change. How do you deal with changes in transitions, changes in functional things? I'm looking at the time and it's going quick. This is a fascinating example of a young man or a young woman who's in the autism spectrum very clearly, and everybody knew it, but her older brother was in the autism spectrum as well on a very high level, and the problem that they ended up getting. But looking at the time that we have, I'm going to skip it, but it's one that we may want to come back to when I talk about the section on human sexuality in the next session that we have, if folks don't mind. It's a fascinating thing that happened that befuddled the prosecutors in this particular state. Okay, so best practices. What are the best techniques to work with teens and adults who are in the autism spectrum, either before they start having problems or once you've identified them with having problems? How do you do that? How do you identify it? How do you work with them? How do you manage it? One of the best ways that I have found is to shape in replacement behaviors. You know, on a simple thing, when you have a lot of things in control, my young man that had my seminarian that had the problems with mumbling, was his temper would get bad when he was a teenager. He would punch the walls. and he had holes all through the walls of his family home. That's what his family told him, that they needed to go to a counselor. Counselor was wonderful at the time. Counselor taught him to take the doors and slam it when you get upset. Worked very functionally. The counselor, after they achieved that, stopped. So he decided he didn't know any other alternative to do things, and learned that when I get upset, I do this. Well, it turns out that when he got to seminary and he got upset, he got really furious in a group meeting with seminarians in a large room. He got up at one point, left the room, slammed the door. Everybody was upset. They didn't realize he had gotten to that upset. Came back into the room 3 minutes later, sat down, as if nothing was wrong. Very calm affect. And they were basically freaked out a bit, because how could this be? He was just furious a minute ago. That's when I first started re-meeting this individual and teaching them alternative ways, because although it was a very good way of handling anger when you were 17 or 18, not necessarily so good when you're 23 or 24 around other individuals. So we found other ways to shape. With kids, for example, rather than punching somebody, themselves or somebody else, I'll take newspaper or old scrap paper and I'll teach them to rip it up or to use a shredder when they're upset, and teach the family to do this when it's not a time when they are upset. So it becomes a game for them. We're going to pretend like we're upset. Instead of hitting your sister, we're going to rip up these papers. Well, they become used to that. Well, the first time the individual becomes upset, he sees the newspaper, he sees you, he sees his sister, and he grabs the newspaper and starts ripping. You have to praise the dickens out of the individual, because he's doing the right thing. Just a little bit of reinforcement at the beginning. All of a sudden, you replace the behavior that becomes problematic with something that's much less severe. Now, you're not going to want me to rip up paper all the time, but you shape it down to something that's more acceptable. We learned this in a very tangible way at the Newcastle Center. When we separated the individuals to just live in buildings that were just for individuals with autism, we set up behavior plans for the buildings, that you would do certain things. The behaviors disappeared because they knew they were dependable rules. They knew that the guards that were there were going to follow specific protocols. The biggest complaint that I had from the guards was how emotionally drained they were after a shift, because these kids sometimes literally clung to their legs because they trusted them, and they would confide in them, and they would talk to them about their problems. So instead of doing what they were doing, they would ask them, can we practice? No, they wouldn't say practice, but can we find some other way to deal with this? Or if they found a problematic behavior, staff started working on developing replacement behaviors. You know, one clear example was a young man that every time he got upset, he would bite himself. His hands were just grossly ugly because he would bite himself in his wrist. If you pushed him and got close to him, he'd bite you. So they kept throwing charges on the kid. We ended up with him. I took my staff and sat with an occupational therapist that worked on sensory type of issues. And she said, don't you understand what's going on? And at that time, I should have thought of this and didn't. This is what I mean. If you ever hear somebody that calls himself an expert, be very leery. There's so much to learn about these things that you're always learning. Well, she suggested he's got an oral sensory type of a problem. Now, this isn't the solution, but this may buy you time. What he's doing when he gets upset, he needs to do something with his mouth. Would you ever consider temporarily just giving him chewing gum? That's all my staff had to hear, was that every time this poor young man got upset, they would throw chewing gum at him. Well, what happened within the course of 6 weeks, his hands were clear. He had scars, of course, but there was no more acute things going on with him until a year and a half later, when his placement fell through. He bit himself once. We found other ways to shape it so he didn't bite when he was upset at people, but that was an extreme example of what happened then. So how do you work with individuals in a prison setting? Which is how I ended up looking at the development of healthy relationships and responding to individuals in a criminal justice setting. The first thing I thought was, if they were taught some of this as children, adolescents, they may not have been here, but they weren't. So I went on. So I thought, if they don't know basic things, I ended up drafting out and writing healthy relationships curriculum, eventually having to finish it with an organization called Wesley Spectrum Services. It's a clinical organization in and around the city of Pittsburgh, dealing with individuals teens and adults with autism and other issues, but principally with autism, and they helped me to finish it. It's a beautiful curriculum at this point in terms of some of the supplemental things that Wesley was able to add. But the notion, the 3-module notion that I have written is a basic way of showing basic competency. I don't assume anything. So the first module deals with hygiene, how you basically clean and wash and do things of that nature. Now, I'll go into it in more depth in our next session, but things like pouring shampoo. Sometimes you'd almost see the little dot of shampoo that they pour into their hands because we would do it in session. And sometimes the individuals just pour and pour and pour until it fell on the floor. By doing it as a group, we showed basically what would be considered acceptable. Or teeth brushing. I can remember this high school student, as we were demonstrating, we gave them new toothbrushes. We had a variety of toothpaste that they could try. He said, I've never brushed my teeth. And we kind of looked at him, and we had everybody, we showed them how to do it. And as he was spitting out the suds into the sink, it was bright red. He was right. He had never brushed his teeth before, which meant he'd probably never gone to a dentist. You learn things about individuals that they don't know. So I go through these modules, which only take 2 to 4 sessions to complete, go into the human sexuality module, particularly for teenagers when they don't recognize social cues, when they don't understand slang, having some of that prior knowledge of even the biology of men and women so that they know what parts are in the current slang that exists to identify it is very useful information. And from there, we go into then the very long module, which will be session 3, talking about relationship development, how to make a friend, how to differentiate a friend from a bully, how to talk inside, how to recognize social cues. I have a fabulous exercise that I use. It's called 44 questions. These individuals by this point are in session together. We session a week, so it's 6 months I've been in session. I said, the person that you've been sitting next with, sit back to back with him. What color's their hair? What color's their eyes? What's their favorite food? And I go on with 44 of these questions. By the 3rd or 4th question, they all drop their heads. They're so egocentric. They know everything about themselves because the world revolves around me, but nothing about the people around them. If you don't know much about the person that you're with, are they going to be your friend? Are you going to be able to date them? Whereas if you know 35, 38 of these answers to these questions, you know a lot about that person. So you probably could be friends with that individual and probably are. Or if it's somebody that you wanted to date or court, it's an indicator that you can do this. Ironically, every time the exercise is done, they all start interviewing each other because they want to know a lot about the other person to see what they can about it. Now, a good clinician is going to recognize that autism is present with lots of individuals, good clinician with autism, and they should be able to detect it as early as 18 months. I do lots of evaluations with people that are adults in their 40s and 50s, adults in their 20s. As much information as I can get, either from somebody that knew them when they were children or early documentation, early medical records, even early school records, enough to give you an indication that there's an onset that these symptoms were likely present when they were children, toddlers. Why would you do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Look at the onset of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, in many examples, may look very much like autism. Schizophrenia typically doesn't come until someone's a teenager. If you have these symptoms before age 5, it gives you a real clear indication to look at it as a developmental disorder. If none of these symptoms seem to be present, or very few of them seem to be present before age 5, and these symptoms start to emerge as a teenager, maybe that's what it was. Maybe it's a psychotic disorder. Maybe there was a head injury. I spent a lot of time in Lagos, Nigeria, looking at individuals with autism there because they're still attempting to build large programs to respond to the autism that they have, which is substantial. Until I realized my 3rd year there, I started asking, does the child ever have malaria? Oh yeah. I got real smart. I said, how old was the child when they started getting malaria? And they started talking, some individuals, within the first month of life. Because of how poor much of that country is, most of the country is not affluent. Many of the individuals were having temperatures in excess of 108 before they would go see a doctor, because the doctors were so hard to get to and so expensive that they would wait 6, 7, 8 days before they would take the child to a doctor to see if the fever would come down. Now, am I looking at an autism spectrum disorder for that child, which very much looks like it, or neurologic damage because of the high and prolonged fever? Lots of reasons as to why it may be present. So there's lots of good ways as well with adults. There are instrumentations such as the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, second edition, along with a detailed developmental history, if you can get it, or other instruments, but the first-hand information is often the best. How do we become pastoral with these individuals? How do I shape in replacement behaviors? And that's what was being basically taught in healthy relationships. Looking at the time, I can go on to some more, but Joe, other questions?
There was one question related to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which of course is a developmental disability due to prenatal alcohol exposure. There was just a question about in your work in the prison system, if you run across that disorder as well, and sort of your experience with that.
It is present in the jails, and I don't know how the jails are in other states. What I found very discouraging, there's a diagnostic center in Pennsylvania where they do most of their initial diagnosis when somebody first comes in. If there's any suspicion of a problem, if there's no suspicion, they may not even go there. There are very few, if any, psychologists, let alone psychiatrists, in these prisons. So identifying something as specific as fetal alcohol syndrome, unless the person comes pre-identified, is not often recognized. It may have very similar symptomatology that one can recognize if one knows to look for it. But if you don't come in pre-identifying it, and then with a treatment plan on how to address it for certain issues, as with many individuals with high functioning autism, they're left on their own. So I don't have much more of a response to it than that right now. I can try to find some models for a subsequent session to talk a little bit more about it, but it's one of those disorders that is very present. I don't know the incidence. I can't generalize to say like 1 in 44 at this point is the guess for individuals with autism, but it's prevalent as well, but I just don't know a number. And I talked about these. If I had to make suggestions, I would start with the basics. I would build skills. I would try to socially increase knowledge, social understanding of what you're doing. And my PowerPoint has, oh, there it goes again. We also do pre-test, which I have with Healthy Relationship, which is a good way to see what type of knowledge they retained or what they didn't. I don't know that you would necessarily do this in a criminal justice setting, but the curriculum, which is available, of course, to adults and can be done individually, I recommend is repeated, not necessarily back to back, but after a period of time. That processing time to understand what the curriculum is takes a bit of time. And the second go round, you learn things that, or you discover that they've focused on things that they didn't the first time. So there's other tools within the curriculum that help you to focus on specifics to see if they understand and they get it and how well they retain it. There's a fourth module, and that's adult living, which isn't part of the curriculum, but it's something perhaps we can do at another time as well. Other questions, Joe?
None that have come through in the chat, but feel free to pop some in, and if we can get to a couple questions here, we would be glad to do that. So if you have any questions for Deacon Larry at this point, just throw them in the chat. You can send it to the host and panelist if you want, or to everyone.
I might add that in the second and third session, we're going to, I guess, have the mics open for questions, or at least try it and see how that works. And again, I'm sorry that I went through the detail of what autism is and some of the examples. Everybody has a different example or a different understanding of what the developmental disorder is. And I wanted to at least provide you with my understanding of how I've evolved to this point, how I do evaluations for individuals. It's all basically the same type of a format, the doctoral students that I work with, I teach this to them so that it's a consistent way using DSM to come up with the diagnosis and explain then and to look for ways of managing various problems, whether they're in criminal justice settings, which fortunately Allegheny County is now starting to more aggressively pursue, the county again around Pittsburgh, or just how to basically change behaviors that they need to.
Yeah.
The term I use a lot, it's not rocket science, but one has to think in a very different way. It's very concrete, very logical. Once you get that logic, go ahead, Joe.
Very good. Well, and just to let people know, today's session is just an introduction on this topic. There's so much to this that we're actually going to do 2 additional sessions, as Deacon Larry mentioned, to kind of tease this out some more. Deacon Larry, I can say, and those sessions will be October 20th and October 27th. So just if you want to be able to dive into this more. I know, Deacon Larry, that when I was a correctional chaplain myself in a juvenile facility, I often came across young people who, at the very least, I suspected were on the autism spectrum, that had some of those symptoms and kind of the social issues or things like that. I'm not a clinician, and our chaplains in our communities here probably are not clinicians. But when you come across, say, a person in a correctional setting, is there for those of us who are not clinicians but recognize that maybe autism is present, is there just like a stance that we can take that's helpful, or just kind of general things that are good or not good when interacting, even particularly if we're acting as a chaplain and we're not tasked with, helping people change behaviors, that kind of thing, but just a general stance? So what do you think?
It takes a little bit of time to hear how the individual communicates. They have a tendency to really look towards authority figures as being all-knowing and can help them with anything. If you get them to the point that they're a little bit relaxed, that they can talk with you and befriend you, you'll learn how they communicate. Having a good therapeutic ear to listen to what they're saying. If there's a consistent way that you see that they keep getting in trouble, whether it's they're talking out or whether they're doing certain activities that keep getting them in trouble with guards or whomever, ask them, are there other ways that you could express that type of problem or that issue, rather than yelling something out or whatever? What else could we do? They likely may have something. If they do not, could you suggest something? And that's what I might ask you to do. What's a logical thing that they could do while you're in that setting that you might suggest to them that might be helpful? Come up with a couple of ideas, or we could talk about a couple of ideas perhaps on some of this, and talk about how you might shape that in. If they've begun to befriend you and to trust you, you might say, well, let's role play and practice. Pretend I'm the guard, and you're having the problem. Let's see if there's another way that we can do this that can help you to express yourself without getting you in trouble. And then you practice this alternative way, and you keep doing it to the point that they get it. Remember, when they become upset, it's like they get to the point of no return. So they're going to do exactly what they did last time. If you practice replacement behavior, now they have 2 possibilities of things that they can do. And because they want to please you, because that's really what they want to end up doing, they're going to try the new behavior. And as long as the guard catches on, or if you're present, and it's reinforced that that's a good way to ask for it. They may not say it so nicely, but that's a better way to, ask or do what you're doing. Sometimes it could be writing down what the issue is. Sometimes it could be, let's hold off and tell me right after you have a problem like that before you act on it, or whatever it happens to be. Replacement behaviors aren't rocket science. They're often very, very simple things. And so any idea, my Sunday morning religious education program, I use teenagers that don't have any college training, of course, and they are the best of mentors because they don't know what to do and they do what comes natural to them, and it works out marvelously. So sometimes it doesn't take, a behavior analyst to suggest ways to shape the behavior. Sometimes it does, but most often it doesn't. And if you practice it when they're calm, that becomes a real alternative, and that's a very tangible thing that you can do. And you're likely to be more friendly to them than most of the people that they encounter, so they're going to listen to you. a little bit of supervision on how to do some of that can go such a long way in the quality of life of somebody that's there. You know, you're accountable for what you've done. That doesn't mean that you have to be tortured the whole time that you're there. We can find ways to manage that time that you're there as well off as you can be, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, that's super helpful. I mean, even just having the skills of like brainstorming and role playing together is very tangible and helpful. Deacon Larry, I just want to thank you on behalf of the Catholic Prison Ministries Coalition for this amazing overview of autism spectrum disorder and how it kind of shows up oftentimes in the correctional setting. This is amazing. Again, everyone, there's more to come. October 20th and 27th, Deacon Larry will take us further into this. But by ways of doing some commercials for you for what's coming up next in the wonderful world of CPMC, we've got some great things coming up. One is we have entrepreneurship, passing on your experience. In his second career as an executive director of DuPage County, Michael Berry passes on his 20 years of business knowledge to people returning from incarceration. This is an upcoming town hall to hear about this innovative approach to reentry work. We also have Finding the Dignity of Life in the Traumatized and Broken. CPMC is fortunate to have Father Stan Bosch as our next webinar presenter for Pro-Life Month. He is a psychotherapist, a prison minister, a pastor of St. Raphael Church in Los Angeles, and minister to Los Angeles's gang-involved youth for more than 20 years. He's a member of the Missionary Servants of the Most Holy Trinity, a religious community that works with the poor and the abandoned. You will want to hear him speak. So tune into that next webinar. Again, as I mentioned before, we will continue on with our series of developmental disabilities and incarceration with Deacon Larry. Part 2 will focus on the tools for effective ministry. It will formally introduce modules 1 and 2 of healthy relationships, as Deacon Larry talked about, on hygiene and human sexuality. And then moving on to part 3 of healthy relationships from there. And so we're, again, October 20th and October 27th. We also have a very, very special, amazing event coming up with Cardinal Tobin and dealing with the issue of addiction. It is an event called Reclaiming Wholeness. It's an exploration of addiction, recovery, community, and spirituality. And in this conversation, CPMC will provide a platform for chaplains, ministers, loved ones, community members, and those in recovery to become compassionately aware and to gain a deeper understanding of the issues surrounding addiction and incarceration. Our featured speakers includes Jim Wahlberg, who I think is the brother of Mark Wahlberg, the actor that you may recognize, Evelyn Duhart from the Ignatian Spirituality Project, Lisa Delora from Just of DuPage County, and of course, our amazing host, His Eminence Cardinal Joseph Tobin from the Archdiocese of Newark. Please check that out. Lots of amazing things coming up. But again, Deacon Larry, just want to thank you so much for your wisdom and expertise, and such a joy to be with you. And many deep thanks to all of you for continuing to engage with CPMC. We are here for you to continue to provide you with resources, networking, support. Keep tuning in, keep visiting the website, and we will look forward to seeing you again soon. God bless everybody.